You think you can hide this from me?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Lies!
Got my shine on, yeah, watch me light up this town tonight.
The floorboards of the small shotgun house in the outer rim of the Ninth Ward were always scrubbed until they shone with a pale, wet gleam, smelling faintly of pine oil and laundry starch. It was a home constructed entirely out of rigid right angles and unforgiving spiritual discipline. In the late 1970s, the St. James household existed as an absolute temple dedicated to traditional order. There was an explicit, unbending rule for the crisp, razor-sharp crease of a Sunday shirt and a specific, unyielding rhythm to the nightly hymns that drifted out into the thick New Orleans heat. On the afternoon of her 16th birthday, she sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in the cramped back room. To the rest of the neighborhood, the youth who occupied this space was known as Marcus, a quiet, hyper-vigilant boy with deep-set, observant, dark brown eyes who walked with his shoulders rolled permanently forward, trying desperately to occupy as little physical space as humanly possible. But in the absolute stillness of the empty afternoon, when her father was out visiting parishioners, that boy faded completely away. With fingers that trembled slightly from a potent cocktail of profound fear and intoxication, she reached beneath the heavy, ironed cotton mattress. Her hand brushed against a hidden tear in the ticking, pulling out her secret treasury. 3 silk scarves, one a vibrant emerald green, the others a soft faded pink and a deep royal blue. Alongside them lay a single gold-plated tube of drugstore lipstick, one through a week of entirely skipped school lunches. She uncapped the lipstick, the rich, waxy scent of it filling her lungs like holy incense. Turning to a small shard of broken mirror she kept tucked behind an old picture frame, she carefully smoothed the crimson paste over her lips. For a fleeting moment, the sharp, hyper-masculine lines of her jawline seemed to soften under the warm afternoon light. She draped the emerald silk scarf over her head, letting the cool fabric frame her mahogany skin. She wasn't an anomaly. She wasn't a mistake. In the quiet mirror, she saw her true self beginning to bloom from the shadows. She whispered her name into the empty room, a soft, sacred breath of air. Evangeline. The peace of the afternoon did not last. Within weeks, the small house became a battlefield of whispered accusations and heavy, suffocating silences. The first major fracture occurred on a humid Tuesday evening after dinner. Evangeline had tried to express her discomfort with the heavy, masculine wool suits her father forced her to wear to the St. James Baptist Church. Silas St. James sat at the head of the mahogany dining table, his large hands resting flat on the wood. He looked at his child, his brow furrowing with a deep, systemic suspicion. "A man dresses with authority, Marcus," Silas said, his voice dropping into the low, rumbling register he used when he was commanding his congregation from the pulpit. "You walk around this house with your head down, slouching like you're ashamed of the strength God gave you. I see the way you handle your clothes. It's soft. It's delicate." "It's not about being soft, Papa," Evangeline said, her voice quiet but carrying a desperate underlying note of resistance. She squeezed her thighs together under the table, her knuckles whitening. "The fabric, the shape of it. It feels like a cage. I just want to wear something lighter. Something that feels natural to who I am." Martha St. James froze in the middle of clearing the porcelain plates, her eyes darting between her husband and her child. "Marcus, hush that foolish talk." she warned quickly, her voice sharp with anxiety. Your father knows what's right for a young man in this parish. You will wear the tailored suits he buys you, and you will carry yourself like a pillar of this community. There will be no softness under this roof. Silas leaned forward, the shadows from the overhead light casting harsh, angular lines across his face. If I catch you altering those clothes or looking at the girls' things in the department stores again, you'll answer to the Lord and you'll answer to my belt. Do you understand me? Evangeline looked down at her plate, the silence that followed swallowing her completely. The arguments grew more frequent, transforming the home from a sanctuary into a permanent state of psychological siege. Every piece of clothing Evangeline wore was scrutinized with religious fervor. On a Friday evening before a church social, Martha walked into the back bedroom without knocking, catching Evangeline trying to soften the collar of her button-down shirt by folding it inward to mimic a more feminine neckline. Martha snatched the fabric out of her hands, her face twisting with a mixture of terror and disgust. What are you doing to this collar? Martha hissed, her hands shaking as she pulled the cotton straight. You're trying to change the shape of it. You're trying to make it look like a blouse, Marcus. Do you think I'm blind? I see the way you watch the women coming down the aisle on Sunday. I see the way you touch the silk ribbons in my sewing basket. Why does it matter so much to you, Ma? Evangeline cried out, the frustration bursting through her usual wall of hypervigilance. She stood up, her tall, slender frame trembling. Why can't I just wear what makes me feel alive? Why do I have to pretend to be a soldier in Papa's army every single day? Because the world is a dangerous place for a boy who forgets his place, Martha yelled back, her voice cracking as she threw the shirt onto the bed. Your father is a minister of the gospel. His reputation is the only thing keeping this family safe from the wolves out there. If the deacons see you acting peculiar, if they think my son is afflicted with a perverse spirit, they will ruin us. You are a boy, Marcus. You will dress like a boy. You will talk like a boy. And you will stop trying to tear this house apart with your vanity. Martha stormed out, slamming the door so hard, the shard of mirror behind the picture frame rattled against the wall, a tiny fracture spreading across its silvered surface. The inevitable explosion arrived with the terrifying force of a hurricane. It was a Saturday evening, and the air was thick with the scent of approaching rain. Silas had returned early from a deacon's meeting, his footsteps heavy and unhurried as he entered the house. Evangeline was in her room, believing she had hours of privacy. She had pulled the emerald green silk scarf from its hiding place, wrapping it elegantly around her shoulders as she practiced moving gracefully across the linoleum floor. The door didn't just open, it was shattered inward. Silas stood in the frame, his eyes instantly locking onto the vibrant green silk draped over his child's shoulders. The absolute fury that crossed his features was biblical in its intensity. He lunged forward, his massive hand tearing the scarf away with a force that rips the delicate silk right down the middle. Abomination! Silas roared, his voice shaking the thin plaster walls of the shotgun house. He threw the ruined silk to the floor and immediately began tearing the mattress off the frame, his hands ripping through the hidden pocket in the box spring. The remaining pink and blue scarves were thrown into the air alongside the gold tube of lipstick, which shattered against the floorboards, leaving a bright red streak across the wood. Silas, no! Martha screamed. rushing into the room and clutching her apron, her face pale with horror as she saw the contraband scattered across the floor. "Oh Lord, the trouble has come to our porch. The sickness is in our house." Silas unbuckled the heavy leather belt from his waist, the brass buckle clinking with a sharp, terrifying sound. "You have defied me for the last time," Silas hissed, his sweat dripping onto the floorboards as he raised the leather. "I will beat this demonic spirit out of you if it's the last thing I do as a servant of God." The beating that followed was legendary among the close-knit houses of the block. It wasn't merely an act of physical violence. It was a highly structured, fanatical ritual, a frantic symphony of deliverance prayers, screamed into the humid evening air, underscored by the rhythmic, heavy strike of the leather against bare skin and the muffled, desperate cries of a child suffocating beneath the absolute weight of her father's wrath. Silas sweated through his white linen church shirt, his breath ragged and mechanical as he drove the belt down again and again. He was a man attempting to break the spirit to save the flesh, viewed through the distorted lens of his own theological terror. "Deliver this child from the snare of the devil," Silas shouted with every strike. "Break the spirit of perversion. Make him a man of God." Evangeline lay on her side, her face pressed against the cool wood, her body absorbing the absolute fury of the church's judgment. She didn't beg for Marcus anymore. She held on to the name Evangeline in her mind like a shield, a secret sanctuary that the leather belt could never truly reach. The red smudge of the shattered lipstick stared back at her from the floorboards, a bloody symbol of the identity they were trying so desperately to erase. "You are a sickness," Silas hissed, his voice dropping into a ragged, venomous whisper as he finally lowered the belt, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Thick beads of sweat tracked down his lined forehead, hitting the polished floorboards with soft, wet impacts. He stood over the trembling form on the floor, his face a mask of profound disgust. "I didn't father a freak. I didn't raise a degenerate to mock my pulpit. I fathered a man who would carry my name with honor into the kingdom." Evangeline lay perfectly still, her breathing shallow and painful. Through the haze of blinding tears and swelling skin, she raised her eyes toward the dark doorway, searching for the one person who was supposed to offer unconditional mercy. Martha stood there, her small hands twisting her cotton apron into tight, defensive knots. Her lips were moving rapidly, but no sound was coming out. "Ma," Evangeline choked out, a faint, desperate plea slipping past her bleeding lips. She reached an arm out toward her mother, a silent prayer for a sliver of maternal comfort, for a single sign that she was still recognized as a human being. Martha's wet eyes flared with a brief, agonizing conflict, but as Silas turned his stern, unyielding gaze toward her, the conflict vanished. Her expression hardened into a cold, protective mask of religious piety. She didn't step into the room. She didn't reach down to touch her child. Instead, Martha simply turned her back, walking away down the corridor as she began to pray aloud for a son she believed was already burning in the deepest pits of hell. The days that followed the beating were defined by a freezing domestic winter. No one spoke to Evangeline. Her plates were left on the kitchen counter after her parents had finished eating, and her presence was treated like a contagious disease. But the physical violence hadn't broken the structural foundation of who she was. It had simply burned away the last remnants of her willingness to hide. She spent her nights staring at the ceiling, listening to the humid wind rattle the window panes. She realized with absolute clarity that she could not survive another month inside the right angles of Silas's world. To stay meant to allow them to murder Evangeline in the dark, leaving behind a hollow, mechanical shell named Marcus, who would spend his life living a lie. On a gray, stormy Thursday afternoon, while the rain was beginning to build over the Mississippi River, Evangeline made her choice. She walked to her mother's sewing closet at the end of the hall. Hidden behind the heavy winter coats was a simple, vintage floral dress that had belonged to Martha's younger sister, a dress with soft, flowing curves and a vibrant pattern of yellow jasmine. With steady hands, Evangeline pulled the dress off its hanger. She brought it back to her room, her heart pounding with a strange, intoxicating mix of terror and absolute liberation. She was done folding her soul to fit their floor plan. Evangeline stepped into the floral dress, pulling the fabric up over her slender shoulders. As the zipper slid shut with a sharp, metallic click, she felt a profound shift in the atmosphere of the room. The dress didn't just fit her body, it anchored her spirit. It was the first time she had ever felt structurally complete. She walked over to the small vanity mirror, ignoring the pain in her healing back. She took the remains of her drugstore makeup and carefully touched up her face, softening the sharp angles of her jawline with a delicate layer of powder. She looked at herself, really looked at herself, and for the first time in 16 years, she wasn't afraid of the reflection staring back. "You are Evangeline," she whispered to the mirror, her voice dropping into that rich, slow contralto that would one day command the underground stages of the city. "And you are alive." The heavy front door of the house slammed shut downstairs, signaling her father's return from the mid-week prayer meeting. The floorboards groaned as Silas's measured, heavy footsteps began their slow march up the stairs. Evangeline didn't run to hide the dress. She didn't pull a coat over her shoulders to minimize her presence. She stood perfectly straight in the center of the room, her head held high, waiting for the final collision between her father's iron and her own silk. The bedroom door opened and Silas stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes traveled down the length of the floral dress, the yellow jasmine pattern, standing out like a flame against the dark, somber colors of the room. The silence that followed was heavy, wet, and suffocating, the quiet before the lightning strike. "Get out of that garment," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm, a low hiss that carried more danger than his previous roars. "No, Papa," Evangeline said, her voice remarkably steady. "This is who I am. Marcus is dead. He never really existed. I am your daughter, Evangeline." Silas didn't answer with words. He reached out, his massive fingers gripping the collar of the dress, and dragged her violently out of the room. Evangeline stumbled, her heels catching on the linoleum as Silas pulled her down the narrow hallway and out onto the front porch, throwing her down against the wooden floorboards. The rain was pouring down now, a driving, relentless New Orleans storm that slicked the porch and turned the unpaved street into a river of thick, black mud. Martha rushed out onto the porch behind them, her face twisted in panic as she saw the neighbors beginning to open their curtains across the street, watching the public undoing of the St. James family dignity. Silas, please, the neighbors are looking. Bring him inside. There's nothing to bring inside, Martha, Silas declared, his voice booming over the sound of the thunder. He pointed a long, shaking finger down at Evangeline, who was trying to stand up, the hem of the floral dress soaking through with rain. Look at it. This is a freak, a mockery of everything holy. Silas marched to the edge of the porch, grabbing the small canvas bag Evangeline had packed days earlier and throwing it violently into the mud of the street. It landed with a heavy, wet thud, the contents spilling out into the dark water. If you stay in that dress, if you dare to step off this porch as that perversion, Silas shouted, his hand gripping the wooden railing so tightly the old wood groaned under his weight. Marcus St. James is dead to this house forever. We will hold a funeral for you in our hearts, and your name will be stricken from the book of life. Choose now, boy. Take off that garment and crawl back into this house on your knees, or walk out into that storm and never darken my porch again. Evangeline rose to her full height, her emerald green shawl catching the wind like a sail. The rain slicked her dark mahogany skin, dripping off her chin, but her deep-set dark eyes were fixed entirely on her mother. Ma, Evangeline called out over the downpour, her voice cracking with a final, desperate plea for love. Ma, look at me. Please. Martha stood by the front door, her fingers trembling as she clutched the lace of her apron. For a single, agonizing second, her wet eyes locked onto Evangeline's, a flicker of maternal recognition, of pure, unprotected love seemed to spark in her gaze. Her mouth opened to form a word, her hand reaching out into the cold air of the porch. Silas turned his head, his stern, venomous glare pinning his wife to the frame. Martha, close the door. Martha froze, her hand hovering in the space between her past and her husband's wrath. Her face went completely pale, her shoulders curving inward as the religious terror reclaimed her. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her hand. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't call out her child's name. Martha stepped back into the dim interior of the house, grabbed the brass handle of the heavy oak door, and began to pull it shut. Evangeline watched as the sliver of light from the hallway narrowed down to a single, thin line. Her breath hitched in her chest as the heavy wood groaned against the frame, the lock beginning to turn. The door clicked shut, leaving her entirely alone in the dark of the storm.